The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed harsh penalties on Germany, sowing seeds of resentment. Hyperinflation and economic hardship created fertile ground for extremist ideologies, including the Nazi Party. Exploiting the economic crisis, the Nazis promised to restore Germany's glory. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933 marked the beginning of a totalitarian regime, silencing opposition and persecuting Jews. By the late 1930s, Germany's aggressive expansion alarmed Europe. The Munich Agreement of 1938, ceding the Sudetenland to Germany, emboldened Hitler, setting the stage for war. Hitler's inner circle, including Göring, Himmler, and Goebbels, played key roles in enforcing Nazi ideology. They controlled the military, secret police, and propaganda, creating a ruthless regime. By 1939, the Nazi Party controlled every aspect of German life. Education, arts, and the legal system were all tools for Nazi indoctrination and suppression of dissent. Hitler's foreign policy defied the Treaty of Versailles, leading to the remilitarization of the Rhineland and the annexation of Austria. The Munich Agreement's failure to curb Hitler's ambitions made war inevitable. Daily life in Nazi Germany was marked by a facade of normalcy, but individual freedoms were steadily eroded. The regime's policies promoted traditional roles for women and controlled leisure activities to instill Nazi values. Propaganda was crucial in Nazi Germany, with Goebbels manipulating public opinion through radio, newspapers, and films. Public spaces and events were saturated with Nazi symbols and messages, fostering a cult of personality around Hitler. The Gestapo's terror tactics and the concentration camp system enforced conformity and silenced dissent. The Kristallnacht pogrom in 1938 marked a turning point in the persecution of Jews, foreshadowing the Holocaust. Rearmament was central to Nazi economic policy, transforming factories and reducing unemployment. However, this focus on military production led to rationing and a decline in living standards, revealing the unsustainable nature of the economy. The Nazi regime's impact on German workers was complex. Programs like Strength Through Joy improved living standards, but this masked a darker reality. Independent trade unions were abolished, replaced by the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front. Strikes were outlawed, and dissent was brutally repressed. Wages stagnated, and workers' mobility was restricted by government regulations. Labor conscription forced many into harsh, poorly paid work. Despite economic achievements, many faced declining living standards and loss of rights. Central to the Nazi economic vision was autarky, or economic self-sufficiency. Hitler believed Germany needed to minimize reliance on international trade and secure resources within its borders or through expansion. This led to policies aimed at achieving self-sufficiency, like the four-year plan launched in 1936. Overseen by Hermann Göring, it aimed to boost industrial production in key sectors. The government invested heavily in research to find substitutes for imports. Farmers were encouraged to increase output, and strict controls were placed on foreign currency exchange. The pursuit of autarky led to some successes but also inefficiencies and shortages. It justified Hitler's aggressive foreign policy, leading to the invasion of Poland in 1939. This event, driven by the desire for resources, plunged the world into war. The year 1939 dawned with an unsettling tension gripping Europe. Hitler, emboldened by his bloodless victories in Austria and Czechoslovakia, turned his gaze eastward, his sights set on Poland. The Polish question, as it became known, revolved around the status of the free city of Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland, and the Polish Corridor, a strip of land separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Danzig, a predominantly German city, held a strategically vital position on the Baltic Sea, while the Polish corridor represented a symbolic wound inflicted upon Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler demanded the return of Danzig to Germany, and the creation of a highway and railway through the Polish corridor, linking Germany to East Prussia. These demands, couched in language of historical grievance and national unity, masked a deeper ambition: the conquest and subjugation of Poland as a prelude to further expansion eastward. Poland, however, refused to bow to Hitler's demands. Backed by guarantees of support from Britain and France, the Polish government recognized the true nature of Hitler's ambitions, understanding that concessions would only embolden him further. Throughout the spring and summer of 1939, tensions escalated as Hitler ratcheted up the pressure on Poland. German propaganda relentlessly demonized the Poles, accusing them of persecuting ethnic Germans living within their borders and fabricating incidents to justify a military intervention. The German military, the Wehrmacht, amassed troops and equipment along the Polish border, their movements closely monitored by anxious observers in the West. The world held its breath, sensing that the fragile peace was about to shatter. The inevitable arrived on September 1, 1939, at dawn. The German Wehrmacht, a formidable force honed by years of rearmament and driven by the racist ideology of the Nazi regime, unleashed a devastating blitzkrieg upon Poland. Tanks, spearheaded by dive bombers of the Luftwaffe, smashed through Polish defenses, their rapid advance overwhelming the outnumbered and outgunned Polish forces. The Polish army, equipped with outdated weaponry and relying on outdated tactics, fought bravely but stood little chance against the overwhelming might of the German war machine. The invasion of Poland triggered an immediate response from Britain and France. After issuing ultimatums demanding a German withdrawal, both countries declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, honoring their commitments to Poland. However, the declarations of war rang hollow for the beleaguered Poles. While Britain and France possessed formidable military forces, they were unprepared for a full-scale war with Germany. The years leading up to the conflict had been marked by appeasement and a reluctance to confront Hitler, allowing Germany to gain a significant military advantage. The initial response from the West was limited to minor military actions, primarily defensive in nature. The British Royal Air Force launched bombing raids against German naval targets, while the French army made a token advance into the Saarland, a German industrial region bordering France. However, these actions proved insufficient to deter the German advance into Poland. The Polish government, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, fled to Romania, their country rapidly falling under Nazi control. The swift collapse of Polish resistance left Europe bracing for a wider conflict. However, the anticipated onslaught against France did not materialize. Instead, an eerie silence descended upon the Western Front, a period that would become known as the Phony War, or Sitzkrieg. The German army, having secured its eastern border, remained poised along the French frontier, seemingly content to consolidate its gains and await further developments. This period of relative inactivity, however, was deceptive. While the guns remained largely silent on the Western Front, both sides used the time to bolster their defenses and prepare for the inevitable clash to come. The British Expeditionary Force, dispatched to France in the early days of the war, dug in along the Belgian border, while the French army strengthened its fortifications along the Maginot Line, a formidable defensive barrier stretching along the Franco-German border. The Phony War, while seemingly a period of inactivity, had far-reaching consequences. It allowed Germany to consolidate its control over Poland and to redeploy its forces westward, preparing for the eventual invasion of France. For Britain and France, the delay provided a much-needed opportunity to bolster their defenses and to mobilize their economies for war production. However, the lack of decisive action also bred a sense of complacency among some in the West, a dangerous underestimation of the true nature of the Nazi threat that would have devastating consequences in the months to come. The Phony War was merely an interlude, a brief respite before the storm of war engulfed Europe in its entirety. As the final days of 1939 slipped away, Germany stood at a crossroads, poised precariously between a past haunted by defeat and a future shrouded in the dark clouds of war. The Nazi regime had unleashed a wave of terror and repression upon its own people, crushing dissent and imposing its twisted ideology upon every aspect of German life. The invasion of Poland shattered the fragile peace, plunging Europe into a new and devastating conflict. The world watched in horror as the German war machine crushed Polish resistance with lightning speed. The year 1939 had been a mere prelude, a gathering storm that foreshadowed the cataclysm to come. The seeds of destruction sown in the fertile ground of resentment and economic hardship following Germany's defeat in World War I had finally borne their bitter fruit. The Treaty of Versailles, once seen by many as a guarantor of peace, had instead become a symbol of humiliation and a rallying cry for those who sought to restore Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party, fueled by hatred and economic anxieties, exploited this discontent, manipulating fear and resentment to seize power. The year 1939 exposed the true nature of the Nazi regime, revealing its contempt for democracy and its thirst for conquest. The persecution of Jews escalated dramatically, culminating in Kristallnacht, foreshadowing the genocide to come. The world had to confront the monstrous reality of the Nazi regime. The world that entered 1940 was a fundamentally different place than the one that had greeted the dawn of 1939. The fragile peace that had prevailed for 2 decades had been shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a global conflict that would engulf nations and continents, leaving an indelible scar upon the human psyche. The old certainties, the belief in progress and the triumph of reason, lay in ruins, buried beneath the rubble of bombed-out cities and the shattered dreams of a generation. The year 1939 marked the end of an era, the close of a chapter in human history. The world had entered a dark and uncertain period, a time of unspeakable violence and unimaginable suffering. The full extent of the catastrophe that awaited, the horrors of the Holocaust, the unimaginable brutality of total war, lay hidden in the mists of the future. Yet even in the face of such darkness, glimmers of hope remained. The courage and resilience of the Polish people, the steadfastness of Britain and France in the face of overwhelming odds, and the growing resistance movements within Nazi-occupied Europe all testified to the enduring human spirit, the refusal to surrender to despair even in the darkest of times. The year 1939, for all its horrors and tragedies, also marked the beginning of a global struggle against tyranny, a fight for freedom and human dignity that would ultimately triumph over the forces of darkness. The legacy of 1939 continues to resonate in the 21st century, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the enduring importance of vigilance in the face of oppression. The lessons learned from that fateful year, the dangers of appeasement, the seductive allure of extremist ideologies, and the need for international cooperation to confront threats to global security remain as relevant as ever in our own turbulent times. The year 1939 serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that the forces of darkness are never truly vanquished, but rather lie dormant, awaiting the opportunity to re-emerge and wreak havoc upon the world. It is a year that should forever be etched in our collective memory, a stark warning from the past to safeguard the hard-won peace and to remain vigilant in the face of those who would seek to divide us and plunge the world back into the abyss of hatred and war. The year 1939, a year of profound change, a year that witnessed the unraveling of the old order and the descent into global conflict, stands as a pivotal moment in human history, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the enduring importance of confronting evil wherever it may arise. The year 1940 stands as a pivotal turning point in the Second World War, a year that witnessed the full unleashing of Nazi Germany's military might and the rapid expansion of the conflict across Europe. It was a year of stunning victories for the German war machine, but also a time of profound change and upheaval for the German people. The shadow of war loomed large over every aspect of life, from the bustling factories working tirelessly to fuel the war effort, to the quiet anxieties whispered in the privacy of homes. In the spring of 1940, Hitler unleashed his forces in a series of lightning-fast campaigns that would shatter the fragile peace and redraw the map of Europe. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally France. One by one, they fell before the onslaught of the German army. The speed and ferocity of these victories sent shockwaves across the globe. For Germany, these triumphs marked the pinnacle of Nazi power, a moment of intoxicating triumph that seemed to herald a new era of German dominance in Europe. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was a revolutionary military doctrine that combined the speed and mobility of tanks with the devastating power of air support. In the spring of 1940, this new form of warfare was unleashed upon Western Europe with devastating effect. The first target was Denmark, which fell to a German invasion on April 9, 1940, after a mere 6 hours of fighting. The same day, German forces also invaded Norway, encountering stiffer resistance but ultimately securing the country after 6 weeks of fighting. With Scandinavia firmly under their control, the Germans turned their attention to the west. On May 10, 1940, the Wehrmacht launched a surprise attack on the Netherlands, Belgium and France. The assault caught the Allied forces completely off guard, their defenses outmaneuvered by the speed and agility of the German panzer divisions. The Netherlands surrendered on May 14 after the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, bombed the city of Rotterdam, causing widespread destruction and civilian casualties. Belgium held out for a few more days but was forced to capitulate on May 28. The fall of Belgium left the French army's northern flank exposed, allowing the Germans to encircle and capture a large Allied force at Dunkirk. While the German army was racking up victories abroad, life on the home front was undergoing a profound transformation. The outbreak of war had a profound impact on every aspect of German society, from the economy to daily life. The Nazi regime, determined to mobilize all resources for the war effort, implemented a system of total war. Factories were retooled to produce armaments and other war materials, while consumer goods became increasingly scarce. Rationing was introduced for food, clothing, and other essential items, forcing the German people to adapt to a new era of austerity. Propaganda played a crucial role in maintaining morale and mobilizing support for the war effort. The Nazi regime, through its control of the media, bombarded the German people with messages designed to glorify the military and demonize the enemy. Newspapers were filled with stories of German victories and heroic tales of soldiers fighting for the fatherland. Despite the hardships and sacrifices, many Germans initially embraced the war with a sense of patriotic fervor. The humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic hardships of the Great Depression, and the powerful propaganda of the Nazi regime had created a climate of resentment and nationalistic fervor that Hitler skillfully exploited. Despite the outward appearance of unity and nationalistic fervor, cracks began to appear beneath the surface of German society as the war dragged on. The initial euphoria of victory gradually gave way to a more sobering reality as the human cost of the conflict became increasingly apparent. The constant stream of propaganda could not entirely mask the growing number of casualties, and the news of sons, husbands and fathers killed or wounded in action slowly filtered back to the home front. The strain of total war, with its rationing, shortages and constant air raid drills, also took its toll on the morale of the German people. Moreover, not all Germans were swept up in the tide of nationalistic fervor. The Nazi regime, despite its attempts to create a monolithic state, still faced opposition from various quarters. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, and others who had been persecuted since Hitler's rise to power continued to resist the regime, albeit clandestinely. Religious groups, particularly the Catholic Church, also offered subtle forms of resistance to the Nazi regime's attempts to control all aspects of German life. While the Church officially supported the war effort, many priests and bishops privately expressed concerns about the regime's policies, particularly its persecution of Jews and other minority groups. Section 5. The wheels of industry turn, gearing for total war. The German economy, like every other aspect of German society, was fully mobilized for war in 1940. The Nazi regime, under the direction of Armaments Minister Fritz Todt and later Albert Speer, implemented a system of forced labor that drew on millions of prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and foreign workers to fuel the German war machine. Factories across Germany worked day and night to churn out tanks, planes, artillery pieces, and other weapons of war. The production of consumer goods was drastically curtailed, and resources were diverted to meet the insatiable demands of the military. The Nazi regime's economic policies, while undoubtedly brutal and exploitative, were initially effective in transforming Germany into a formidable military power. The rapid rearmament of the German army, navy and air force in the years leading up to the war was a testament to the effectiveness of the Nazi economic machine. However, the German economy was not without its weaknesses. The reliance on forced labor while providing a vast pool of manpower also created inefficiencies and resentment. The constant pressure to increase production led to a decline in quality and an increase in accidents. Section 6. The propaganda machine, shaping public opinion. Propaganda played a crucial role in the Nazi regime's efforts to maintain morale and mobilize support. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, controlled all media. The propaganda machine glorified the military, demonized the enemy, and promoted national unity. Newspapers and radio broadcasts were filled with patriotic content and speeches. Films like Triumph of the Will promoted Nazi ideology and Hitler's cult of personality. These films were highly effective in shaping public opinion and admiration for the regime. By controlling information, the Nazi regime built support for its policies and persecution. Section 7. The persecution escalates, darkening days for many. While the German war machine was achieving victory after victory on the battlefield, a much darker chapter was unfolding within Germany itself. The persecution of Jews, which had begun with Hitler's rise to power in 1933, intensified dramatically after the outbreak of war. Jews were progressively stripped of their rights and their property. They were banned from certain professions, their businesses were confiscated, and they were subjected to increasingly discriminatory laws and regulations. In many cities, Jews were forced to wear yellow stars to identify themselves as such, making them easy targets for harassment and violence. The Nazi regime also stepped up its campaign of deportations, rounding up Jews from Germany and German-occupied territories and sending them to concentration camps, where they were subjected to forced labor, starvation, and mass murder. The first extermination camp, Chelmno, began operations in December 1941, marking a horrifying escalation in the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish question. The persecution of Jews was not limited to Germany. As the German army conquered vast swaths of Europe, the Nazis imposed their anti-Semitic policies on the occupied territories. Jews across Europe were rounded up, deported, and murdered, marking one of the darkest chapters in human history. Section 8. A continent in chaos, the expanding battlefield. The year 1940 witnessed the rapid expansion of the Second World War, as the conflict spread from Poland to encompass much of Europe. By the end of the year, Germany had conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Luxembourg, while Italy had joined the war on the side of the Axis powers. The fall of France in June 1940 was a particularly significant turning point in the war. With France defeated, Great Britain stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Britain, a months-long air campaign waged over the skies of England, ensued, with the Royal Air Force bravely fighting off the Luftwaffe's attempts to gain air superiority. In North Africa, Italian forces launched an invasion of British-controlled Egypt in September 1940. The Italians initially made some gains, but their advance was halted by British and Commonwealth forces at the Battle of Sidi Barrani in December 1940. The war at sea also intensified in 1940, with German U-boats waging unrestricted warfare against Allied shipping in the Atlantic Ocean. The Battle of the Atlantic, as it became known, would continue for the duration of the war, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Section 9, 1940, a turning point, the road to global conflict. 1940 was a pivotal year in 1 and 2, marking the full unleashing of Nazi Germany's military might and the rapid expansion of conflict across Europe. German victories shattered the illusion of peace, plunging the world into global conflict. For Germany, it was a year of triumph and tragedy. Blitzkrieg victories brought nationalistic fervor but masked societal cracks. The relentless demands of total war and escalating persecution cast a long shadow. The events of 1940 set the stage for even greater horrors to come. The war, which began as a European conflict, soon engulfed the entire world. 1940 marked a descent into darkness, a stark reminder of the fragility of peace. The year 1941 marked a turning point in World War II for Nazi Germany. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, became Germany's undoing. 1941 saw the height of Germany's power and the seeds of its downfall. By 1941, Nazi Germany had transformed into a formidable military power. Their blitzkrieg tactics overwhelmed Europe, but underlying weaknesses began to show. 1941 tested the limits of German power and exposed flaws in the Nazi regime. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began. The initial German advances were stunningly successful, but they underestimated Soviet resilience. The campaign's early victories masked the challenges ahead. Leningrad, encircled by German and Finnish forces, endured an 872-day siege. Nearly 3 million civilians faced starvation and disease, yet refused to surrender. The siege of Leningrad symbolized Soviet resistance and human suffering. In October 1941, the German army launched its final push towards Moscow. The harsh winter and fierce Soviet resistance halted the German advance. The Battle of Moscow marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. By the end of 1941, the momentum of Operation Barbarossa was lost. The German army faced a long, brutal war of attrition on the vast Eastern Front. The year 1941 saw the zenith of German power and the seeds of its downfall. At the start of 1941, the German home front exuded confidence. As the year progressed, the realities of a protracted war began to bite. The initial euphoria waned, replaced by anxiety and hardship. By 1941, Germany's economy was fully mobilized for war. Rationing and propaganda maintained morale and justified hardships. The war effort demanded sacrifices from the German populace. The demands of total war profoundly impacted German women. Women filled workforce gaps, taking on roles traditionally reserved for men. Despite increased responsibilities, they faced discrimination and traditional gender roles. The Nazi regime's persecution of Jews and minorities intensified during the war. Einsatzgruppen carried out systematic murders in occupied territories. The Holocaust was already underway, marking a descent into human depravity. By 1941, Adolf Hitler's grip on Germany was absolute. His early successes bolstered his image as a strong leader. In 1941, Hitler stood at the pinnacle of his power, his fate linked to Germany's. The Nazi Party infiltrated every aspect of German life by 1941. Organizations indoctrinated the population, and the Gestapo suppressed dissent. The Nazi Party's control created an atmosphere of fear and conformity. Cracks in the facade, dissent, and resistance. Despite the Nazi regime's efforts to create a monolithic society, cracks in the facade of unity and conformity began to appear in 1941. The protracted war, the increasing hardships on the home front, and the growing awareness of the regime's brutality fueled dissent and resistance, albeit on a small and often clandestine scale. Opposition to the Nazi regime came from various quarters: individuals who had opposed Hitler from the outset, disillusioned party members, religious groups targeted for persecution, and ordinary citizens who had grown weary of war and repression. Acts of resistance took many forms: distributing anti-Nazi leaflets, listening to banned radio broadcasts, sheltering Jews and other fugitives, and engaging in acts of sabotage against the war effort. These acts of defiance, while often small and isolated, demonstrated that the Nazi grip on power, while formidable, was not absolute. The most organized opposition came from groups like the White Rose, a student resistance group in Munich that distributed leaflets denouncing the Nazi regime and its crimes. The White Rose's members, many of them devout Catholics, were motivated by their moral convictions and their belief in the sanctity of human life. Their courageous actions, which ultimately led to their arrest and execution by the Gestapo, serve as a testament to the indomitable spirit of resistance against tyranny. The year 1941 brought with it a series of momentous decisions for the Nazi leadership, decisions that would have far-reaching consequences for Germany and the course of World War II. The invasion of the Soviet Union, launched in June 1941, was perhaps the most fateful decision of all. Hitler's gamble on a swift and decisive victory in the East backfired spectacularly. The Red Army's stubborn resistance, the vast distances involved, and the harsh Russian winter all conspired to bog down the Wehrmacht in a war of attrition that Germany was ill-prepared to fight. The decision to declare war on the United States, just days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, further compounded Germany's strategic predicament. It brought the industrial might and military resources of the United States into the war on the side of the Allies, sealing Germany's fate. The year 1941 marked a turning point in the war, a year in which the Nazi regime's fortunes began to shift. The initial euphoria of victory gave way to the grim realities of a protracted conflict on multiple fronts. The weight of these decisions, made by a leadership intoxicated by its own propaganda and blinded by its own hubris, would ultimately prove too heavy for Germany to bear. The year 1941 marked a turning point in World War II, particularly on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa initially seemed like another triumph for the Wehrmacht. However, the vastness of the Soviet Union and the brutal winter shattered this myth. The Battle of Moscow exposed the limitations of German military might. The Wehrmacht, ill-equipped for winter, suffered its first major defeat. This setback forced Germany into a protracted war of attrition. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder, consuming men and material. The year 1941 witnessed the transformation of World War II from a primarily European conflict into a truly global war. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought the United States into the war on the side of the Allies, fundamentally altering the balance of power. The United States, with its vast industrial capacity and military potential, had been providing material aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. However, the declaration of war by Germany and Italy, just days after Pearl Harbor, brought the full weight of American military might to bear against the Axis powers. The entry of the United States into the war had profound implications for the global conflict. The American economy, fueled by wartime production, became a vital source of supplies and equipment for the Allied war effort. American troops, fighting in both the European and Pacific theaters, played a crucial role in turning the tide of the war against the Axis powers. The expansion of the war to the Pacific also had significant consequences. The Japanese Empire, seeking to establish a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under its domination, had embarked on a series of aggressive conquests in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The conflict in the Pacific would rage for nearly 4 years, marked by fierce fighting, horrific atrocities, and the eventual use of atomic bombs against Japan. While 1941 began with a sense of triumphalism in Germany, the year's events sowed the seeds of doubt and anxiety that would gradually erode the facade of invincibility surrounding the Nazi regime. The initial euphoria of victory in the West, followed by the early successes in the Soviet Union, had created a climate of national unity and unwavering belief in Hitler's leadership. However, as the war dragged on, the realities of a protracted conflict, with its attendant hardships and sacrifices, began to take their toll on the German home front. The failure to achieve a swift victory in the Soviet Union, coupled with the mounting casualties and the increasing shortages of food and consumer goods, gradually chipped away at the confidence of the German people. The Allied bombing campaign, which intensified in 1942 and 1943, brought the war home to Germany, shattering the illusion of security and invincibility that the Nazi regime had so carefully constructed. The seeds of doubt sown in 1941 would continue to grow as the war progressed, eventually blossoming into open dissent and resistance as the tide turned against Germany. The year 1941, while marking the height of Nazi power, also laid bare the inherent weaknesses of the regime and its ideology, weaknesses that would ultimately lead to its downfall. The year 1941 marked a turning point in World War II, descending into new depths of brutality and barbarism. The German invasion of the Soviet Union unleashed a wave of violence and destruction. The Holocaust was already underway with ghettos and deportations. The Soviet Union also committed atrocities exemplified by the Cotton Forest Massacre. 1941's brutality cast a long shadow over the post-war world. The year 1941 was pivotal in World War II, marked by Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union. The brutal Russian winter and fierce resistance bogged down the Wehrmacht. Declaring war on the United States compounded Germany's strategic woes. 1941 saw the zenith and the beginning of the Nazi regime's decline. The impact of 1941 extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, leaving an indelible mark on the course of the 20th century and shaping the world we live in today. The horrors of the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of European Jews, reached new depths of depravity in 1941 as the Nazi regime, driven by its ideology of racial hatred, implemented its final solution with chilling efficiency. The mass shootings carried out by the Einsatzgruppen in occupied territories, the establishment of ghettos, and the deportation of Jews to concentration and extermination camps all stand as stark reminders of the human capacity for evil and the devastating consequences of unchecked ideology. The war also had a profound impact on the lives of millions of women who were called upon to fill the gaps in the workforce left by men fighting on the front lines. Women worked in factories, producing weapons and ammunition, toiled on farms and staffed offices and hospitals, challenging traditional gender roles and contributing to the war effort in unprecedented ways. The year 1941 also witnessed the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as global superpowers, their rivalry shaping international relations for decades to come. The Cold War, with its ideological clashes, proxy wars, and constant threat of nuclear annihilation, cast a long shadow over the post-war world, a legacy of the global conflict that had erupted in 1939. As we reflect on the events of 1941, it is imperative that we remember the lessons learned from that tumultuous year, lessons that remain relevant in the 21st century. The dangers of unchecked nationalism, intolerance, and racial hatred, so tragically demonstrated by the rise of Nazi Germany and the horrors of the Holocaust, serve as a stark warning against the perils of extremism and the importance of safeguarding human rights and democratic values. The importance of international cooperation and diplomacy in resolving conflicts and preventing future atrocities remains as crucial as ever in a world facing complex challenges, such as climate change, terrorism, and global pandemics. The legacy of 1941 is a complex one, marked by both tragedy and resilience, by the horrors of war and the enduring strength of the human spirit. It is a legacy that reminds us of the importance of vigilance, of confronting injustice, and of striving for a more peaceful and just world. The echoes of 1941 resonate through history, urging us to learn from the past and work towards a future where the mistakes of that tumultuous year are never repeated. The year 1942 marked a turning point in World War II. It was a year that saw the fortunes of the Axis powers begin to wane, and the Allies start to gain the upper hand in a conflict that had already claimed millions of lives. For Germany, it began with the promise of further conquest and consolidation of its vast, newly acquired empire. The Nazi regime, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, had ambitious plans to dominate Europe and beyond. The Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, still seemed invincible after their lightning victories in Poland, France, and the initial stages of the campaign against the Soviet Union. Their blitzkrieg tactics had overwhelmed opponents with speed and ferocity, creating an aura of invincibility around the German military machine. However, by year's end, the tide had begun to turn. The seemingly unstoppable advance of the Wehrmacht was met with fierce resistance, and the cracks in their strategy began to show. The German war machine, stretched thin and facing determined resistance on multiple fronts, stumbled. The vast distances and harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, combined with the tenacity of the Soviet forces, began to take a toll on German morale and resources. The year 1942 witnessed some of the most significant battles of the war, battles that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of Germany and the world. These battles were not just clashes of armies, but also of ideologies and wills. On the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad became a byword for the brutality and futility of the Nazi war effort. The city, reduced to rubble, became the graveyard of the German Sixth Army, marking a decisive defeat for Hitler's ambitions in the East. In North Africa, the tide turned against Rommel's Afrika Korps, signaling the decline of German fortunes in that theater. The Allies, under the command of General Montgomery, began to push back, reclaiming territory and momentum. Beyond the battlefields, 1942 witnessed the horrifying escalation of the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of Jews and other groups deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The scale and efficiency of this atrocity shocked the world and left an indelible mark on history. What had begun as persecution and forced emigration transformed into a campaign of industrialized murder, with death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau operating at full capacity. The sheer horror of these camps, where millions perished, remains a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty. The year 1942 tested the resilience of the German people and exposed the cracks in the facade of Nazi invincibility. The relentless Allied bombing campaigns brought the war to the German homeland, shattering the illusion of safety and security. It was a year of incredible hardship, marked by shortages, bombings, and the ever-present shadow of death. The German populace, once buoyed by the early successes of the war, now faced the grim reality of a prolonged and increasingly desperate conflict. Yet, it was also a year that revealed the courage of those who dared to resist, both within Germany and in the occupied territories. Acts of defiance, both large and small, demonstrated that the human spirit could endure even in the darkest of times. The resistance movements, though often fragmented and facing brutal reprisals, played a crucial role in undermining the Nazi war effort and sowing the seeds of eventual liberation. The Eastern Front remained the focal point of the German war effort in 1942. The vast expanse of the Soviet Union presented both an opportunity and a challenge for the German military. The Wehrmacht, confident from its earlier successes in Western Europe, believed it could replicate its rapid victories on the Eastern Front. Hitler, obsessed with conquering the Soviet Union and seizing its vast resources, believed that a decisive victory in the East would secure German dominance in Europe. His vision was not just about military conquest, but also about ideological supremacy, as he viewed the Soviet Union as the ultimate adversary. The German summer offensive, codenamed Case Blue, aimed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad, a strategic target on the Volga River. The oil fields were crucial for fueling the German war machine, and Stalingrad held symbolic significance due to its name and location. Initially, the German offensive met with success, pushing deep into Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht's advance seemed unstoppable, and the capture of key cities and resources appeared imminent. However, the Red Army, though battered, was far from defeated. The Soviet soldiers, driven by a fierce determination to defend their homeland, began to mount a formidable resistance. They utilized the vastness of their territory to their advantage, drawing the Germans deeper into a grueling conflict. They fought with tenacity, drawing the Wehrmacht into a protracted and costly battle for Stalingrad. The city's ruins became a deadly maze, where every street and building turned into a battleground. The Germans, unprepared for such intense urban warfare, found themselves bogged down in a brutal struggle. The fighting in the ruined city became a brutal, close-quarters affair, a struggle for every street, every building. The harsh winter conditions only added to the misery, as both sides endured freezing temperatures and dwindling supplies. The Battle of Stalingrad, which raged from August 1942 to February 1943, became a turning point in the war. The prolonged conflict drained German resources and morale, while the Soviet Union's resolve only grew stronger. The German Sixth Army, encircled and trapped in the city, suffered catastrophic losses. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, they faced starvation, disease, and relentless Soviet attacks. The once mighty German force was reduced to a desperate and demoralized remnant. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the Red Army, bolstered by winter conditions and fresh reserves, launched a counteroffensive that would eventually drive the Germans back from the gates of Moscow. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a relentless push westward, reclaiming lost territory and turning the tide of the war. The defeat at Stalingrad exposed the limitations of blitzkrieg, the German strategy of lightning warfare that had brought them such swift victories in the early stages of the war. The strategy, reliant on speed and surprise, faltered in the face of determined and well-prepared resistance. The vast distances, harsh climate, and determined resistance of the Soviet Union proved to be a formidable challenge, one that the Wehrmacht, overstretched and undersupplied, was ultimately unable to overcome. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as a testament to the resilience and tenacity of the Soviet people, and a stark reminder of the perils of underestimating one's enemy. While the Wehrmacht fought on the battlefields, the Nazi regime escalated its genocidal campaign against Jews and other groups deemed racially or ideologically inferior. The war provided a grim cover for the Nazis to intensify their atrocities, as the chaos and destruction of the conflict diverted attention from their heinous activities. The regime's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to dehumanize their victims, portraying them as enemies of the state and justifying their systematic extermination. The year 1942 marked a horrifying turning point in the Holocaust, as the Nazis transitioned from persecution and mass shootings to systematic extermination in purpose-built death camps. This shift was not sudden but the result of meticulous planning and a chillingly efficient bureaucracy. The Nazis sought to eliminate entire communities, erasing centuries of culture and history in a matter of months. The scale and speed of the genocide were unprecedented, leaving a scar on humanity that endures to this day. The Wannsee Conference, held in January 1942, formalized the Nazi plan for the final solution of the Jewish question, a euphemism for the systematic murder of European Jews. This meeting, attended by high-ranking officials, was a cold and calculated discussion on how to efficiently carry out genocide. The participants debated logistics, transportation, and the most effective methods of mass murder, all under the guise of administrative efficiency. The conference brought together key figures from the Nazi Party, the SS, and various government ministries to coordinate the logistics of genocide. These men, many of whom were well-educated and held significant power, showed a chilling indifference to the suffering they were about to inflict. Their discussions were devoid of any moral consideration, focusing solely on the practicalities of mass murder. Death camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor became gruesome symbols of the Nazi regime's barbarity. These camps were designed with the sole purpose of extermination, equipped with gas chambers and crematoria to dispose of bodies efficiently. The sheer scale of these operations was staggering, with thousands of people being murdered daily. The camps were a testament to the industrialization of death, where human lives were reduced to mere numbers in a ledger. These camps, designed for mass murder, employed gas chambers and other methods to kill Jews and other victims on an industrial scale. The process was methodical and impersonal, with victims often unaware of their fate until the very last moments. The efficiency of these death factories was a grim reflection of the Nazi regime's commitment to their genocidal ideology. The use of technology and industrial methods to carry out mass murder was unprecedented, and remains one of the darkest chapters in human history. The machinery of the Holocaust, driven by bureaucratic efficiency and chilling indifference to human suffering, claimed millions of lives in 1942 alone. The bureaucrats who managed the logistics of genocide were often far removed from the actual killing, yet their role was crucial. They ensured that trains ran on time, that supplies were delivered, and that the death camps operated smoothly. This detachment from the violence allowed many to distance themselves morally from the atrocities they were facilitating. The Holocaust stands as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred, prejudice, and totalitarian ideology. It is a stark example of what can happen when a society allows itself to be consumed by bigotry and intolerance. The survivors of the Holocaust, and the memories of those who perished, serve as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of remembering and learning from history. It is a testament to the depths of human depravity and the urgent need to combat intolerance and discrimination in all its forms. The lessons of the Holocaust are as relevant today as they were in the past, reminding us of the importance of vigilance, education, and the defense of human rights. By remembering the atrocities of the past, we can work towards a future where such horrors are never repeated. The year 1942 witnessed the increasing mobilization of German society for total war. The demands of the war effort placed immense strain on the German economy and the daily lives of its citizens. Shortages of food, clothing, and other essential goods became commonplace, and rationing measures were tightened. The Nazi regime intensified its propaganda efforts, seeking to maintain morale and bolster support for the war effort. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films bombarded the German people with messages of national unity, military triumph, and the need for sacrifice. The year 1943 marked a pivotal turning point in World War II. For Germany, it was a year of escalating conflicts, mounting losses, and a gradual shift from triumph to tribulation. At the beginning of the year, the Nazi regime led by Adolf Hitler still held a domineering grip over much of Europe. The German war machine, despite facing setbacks in the icy plains of Russia, remained a formidable force. Hitler's ambitions, fueled by early victories, had plunged the world into chaos, and Germany, at the heart of it all, seemed invincible. The German populace, swayed by propaganda and buoyed by initial triumphs, largely remained united behind the Nazi regime. However, beneath the facade of strength and unwavering faith, cracks were beginning to appear. The vastness of the war on multiple fronts, the relentless Allied bombing campaigns, and the growing casualties were slowly chipping away at Germany's resources and morale. The year 1943 would expose these vulnerabilities, marking the beginning of Germany's descent from the zenith of its power. The world in 1943 was a battleground of unprecedented scale. From the frozen Eastern Front to the scorching deserts of North Africa, from the ravaged cities of Europe to the vast expanse of the Atlantic, the war raged on relentlessly. Germany, at the center of this global conflict, was engaged in a titanic struggle for survival. In the East, the brutal conflict with the Soviet Union had entered its third year, draining German manpower and resources. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps, once seemingly invincible, was facing defeat at the hands of the resurgent Allied forces. The Battle of the Atlantic, a relentless struggle for control of the crucial sea lanes, raged on, with German U-boats taking a heavy toll on Allied shipping. The year 1943 would witness some of the most decisive battles of these campaigns, battles that would shape the destiny of Germany and the outcome of the war. The tide was beginning to turn, and for Germany, the path ahead was fraught with peril. The year 1943 would test the resilience of the German war machine, the resolve of its people, and the very foundations of the Nazi regime. The Eastern Front in 1943 was a scene of unimaginable brutality. The vast steppes of Russia bore witness to a clash of titans. The German Wehrmacht faced defeat at Stalingrad. The Battle of Kursk, one of the largest tank battles in history, decided the fate of the Eastern Front. While the Eastern Front consumed the bulk of German resources, the war in North Africa, though smaller in scale, held significant strategic importance. The deserts of North Africa, once a theater of spectacular victories for Rommel's Afrika Korps, were slipping from German control. By the beginning of 1943, the tide had turned decisively against the Axis forces. The Allied victory at El Alamein in late 1942 had broken the back of the German advance, and the subsequent Anglo-American landings in Morocco and Algeria threatened to trap the Axis forces in a pincer movement. Rommel, the Desert Fox, known for his tactical brilliance and daring maneuvers, faced insurmountable odds. His forces, outnumbered and outgunned, were steadily pushed back by the relentless Allied advance. In May 1943, the last remnants of the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, marking the end of the campaign. The defeat in North Africa, though not as devastating as Stalingrad, was a significant blow to German morale and prestige. It also opened the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, relieving pressure on the beleaguered British Isles and paving the way for the Allied invasion of Italy. The North African campaign, once a beacon of hope for the Axis powers, had become a costly and ultimately futile endeavor. Beneath the waves of the Atlantic, a different kind of battle raged, a silent but deadly struggle for control of the crucial sea lanes. The Battle of the Atlantic, a relentless war of attrition, pitted German U-boats against Allied convoys sinking thousands of tons of vital supplies destined for Britain. However, by 1943 the tide was turning. Allied technological advances, such as improved radar and sonar, began to tip the balance in favor of the Allies. The U-boats, once the hunters, were now the hunted. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic ensured the flow of supplies and reinforcements to Britain, paving the way for the eventual liberation of Europe. By 1943, the realities of war had cast a long shadow over everyday life in Germany. The initial euphoria of military victories had given way to a grim determination as the conflict dragged on. Allied bombing campaigns transformed many German cities into landscapes of rubble and ruin. The nightly drone of air raid sirens and the whistle of falling bombs became a constant companion. Food rationing became increasingly stringent, depriving German civilians of basic necessities. Long lines became a common sight outside butcher shops and bakeries. Fresh produce, meat, and dairy products became scarce luxuries, replaced by ersatz substitutes. The relentless demands of the war effort placed immense strain on the German workforce. Women, children, and the elderly were called upon to fill the void in factories, farms, and offices. Factory work became the norm for many German women who toiled long hours producing armaments. School children were organized into youth groups, collecting scrap metal and tending to victory gardens. Despite the hardships, a spirit of resilience persisted among many Germans, fueled by propaganda and national pride. As the tide of war turned against Germany, Goebbels intensified efforts to maintain morale and support for the regime. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and posters bombarded the German people with messages designed to shape public opinion and glorify the Nazi cause. Military victories were exaggerated, setbacks downplayed, and Allied bombings portrayed as barbarity. Jews and Bolsheviks were dehumanized, justifying brutal policies. The cult of personality around Hitler maintained the illusion of strength and unity. Despite relentless propaganda, cracks appeared in the facade of unity. Mounting casualties, hardships, and the realization that victory was far from assured sowed seeds of doubt. The Allied bombing campaigns exposed the regime's hollowness, leading some Germans to question the Führer's leadership and the price of his ambitions. As 1943 progressed and the tide of war turned against Germany, Hitler's grip on power relied increasingly on fear and coercion. Nazi rallies were replaced by suspicion and paranoia. The Gestapo's powers expanded, deepening control over society. Neighbors informed on neighbors, fear silenced dissent. Concentration camps expanded, shifting from detention to extermination. Millions of lives were claimed, casting a dark shadow over history. The year 1943 marked a turning point for the Axis powers. Germany, Italy, and Japan faced mounting defeats and diverging interests. The surrender in North Africa and the invasion of Sicily led to Mussolini's downfall. Italy became a battleground, weakening the Axis. Hitler occupied Italy, turning it into a puppet state. Japan, struggling in China and the Pacific, couldn't support Germany. The Axis alliance was unraveling, hastening their defeat. Despite the Nazi regime's efforts to maintain a facade of strength, 1943 brought a growing realization within the upper echelons of power that Germany's war effort was faltering. Catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, relentless Allied bombing, and dwindling resources painted a grim picture. The myth of German invincibility lay shattered, replaced by unease and foreboding. Within the military, doubts surfaced about Hitler's strategic acumen. The failed offensive at Kursk exposed the limitations of German military might. The Allied invasion of Italy further stretched German resources. As the year progressed, the strategic initiative shifted to the Allies, leaving Germany on the defensive. The specter of defeat loomed large over the Third Reich. 1943 marked a profound shift in World War II, setting in motion events leading to Germany's downfall. As Germany's strategic position deteriorated in 1943, a desperate hope emerged within the Nazi leadership: Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. These advanced technological marvels were envisioned to turn the tide of war. Hitler clung to the promise of these Wunderwaffen as a beacon of hope. Resources were poured into ambitious research and development programs. Among the most prominent were the V1 and V2 rockets. These terror weapons were hailed by Nazi propaganda as harbingers of a new era. However, the reality proved far less impressive. The V weapons were expensive, inaccurate, and had little impact on the war. The May 262 jet fighter showcased German ingenuity, but arrived too late to alter the air war. Production delays and technical problems hampered its effectiveness. The gamble on Wunderwaffen proved to be a costly distraction. The pursuit of technological marvels failed to deliver the decisive advantage. Hitler's hope in Wunderwaffen reflected the desperation of the Nazi regime. 1943 was marked by strategic missteps rooted in hubris and a misreading of the strategic landscape. Hitler, increasingly isolated, believed in his own infallibility. This led to costly blunders that hastened Germany's demise. The failed offensive at Kursk exemplified Hitler's strategic miscalculations. Despite advice to abandon the offensive, Hitler pressed on. The resulting battle proved to be a costly defeat for the Germans. The decision to occupy Italy stretched German resources thin. The Italian campaign became a drain on German manpower and resources. These strategic missteps highlighted the flaws in Hitler's leadership. The importance of accurate intelligence became critical as the war progressed. Germany's intelligence apparatus began to falter in 1943. The most glaring failure occurred before the Allied invasion of Normandy. Germany's intelligence agencies failed to prepare for an invasion in Normandy. This failure had catastrophic consequences for Germany. Even before Normandy, cracks in Germany's intelligence were evident. The underestimation of Soviet capabilities and misjudgment of Allied intentions highlighted shortcomings. These intelligence failures compounded Germany's strategic difficulties. The fog of war seemed to descend upon Germany with particular intensity. The Nazi leadership was blinded to the realities of the battlefield. 1943 marked a turning point in World War II. The seemingly invincible German war machine began to falter. The echoes of 1943 reverberated throughout the remaining years of the war. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad cast a long shadow over the German military. The myth of German invincibility lay shattered. The loss of an entire army dealt a blow to German manpower and morale. The Allied victory in North Africa exposed the limits of German power. The loss of Rommel's Afrika Korps deprived Germany of a valuable strategic asset. These setbacks eroded the German people's faith in the Nazi regime. 1943 marked the beginning of a long road to defeat for Germany. The strategic initiative shifted to the Allies. The Red Army launched a relentless counteroffensive. The Allied invasion of Normandy established a second front in Western Europe. Despite fierce resistance, the German military proved unable to halt the Allied advance. Paris was liberated in August 1944. The Western Allies pushed towards the German border. The Red Army continued its advance from the east. The final months of the war witnessed unimaginable destruction. The Nazi leadership retreated into the Führer bunker in Berlin. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. 1943 witnessed the sowing of seeds of destruction, with far-reaching consequences. The Allied bombing campaign inflicted immense suffering upon the German civilian population. The destruction of infrastructure created a humanitarian crisis. The psychological scars of the bombing campaign would linger for generations. The economic consequences of the war were devastating. The destruction of industrial capacity left the German economy in shambles. The loss of territory and the burden of reparations hampered Germany's recovery. The political landscape of Germany lay in ruins. The Allied powers implemented denazification policies. The division of Germany into East and West complicated post-war recovery. 1943 marked the beginning of Germany's defeat and a long journey of reconstruction. The year 1943 was a turning point, marking the beginning of a long and arduous journey. By the close of 1943, the die was cast for the Third Reich. The aura of invincibility had dissipated. The year's events formed a tapestry of despair. The war of conquest had become a fight for survival. The turning point of 1943 was a fracture in the Nazi regime's narrative. The German people could no longer ignore the reality. The promised thousand-year Reich was crumbling. The Nazi leadership grappled with internal divisions. The twilight of the gods had begun. The Third Reich was slipping into the abyss of history. 1943 marked the beginning of the end. The legacy of 1943 extended beyond the battlefields. It resonated in the rubble-strewn streets of German cities. The physical scars of war served as a constant reminder of destruction. The task of rebuilding would prove daunting. Amidst the ashes of defeat, a glimmer of hope emerged. The downfall of the Third Reich marked the end of Nazi tyranny. The Allied powers set about rebuilding Germany. The lessons of 1943 served as a cautionary tale. The year 1943 marked the beginning of a new era of peace and prosperity. Section 3. A New Dawn. The end of World War II in 1945 ushered in a new chapter in German history. One marked by the challenges of reconstruction, the complexities of denazification, and the enduring legacy of the war. Germany, divided and occupied, faced the daunting task of rebuilding its shattered economy, reintegrating millions of refugees and displaced persons, and coming to terms with its Nazi past. The year 1943, though a time of darkness and despair, also sowed the seeds for a more hopeful future. The defeat of Nazi Germany, a regime built on hatred and fueled by conquest, paved the way for a new Germany, one committed to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The road to recovery was long and arduous, marked by political divisions, economic hardships, and the enduring legacy of war. Yet the German people, with remarkable resilience and determination, embraced the challenges of rebuilding their nation, transforming it into a beacon of democracy and a leading force for peace and cooperation in Europe. The lessons of 1943, a year of turning tides and shattered illusions, resonated throughout the post-war era, shaping not only Germany's destiny, but also the course of European history. From the ashes of defeat and destruction emerged a new dawn, a testament to the enduring human spirit and the transformative power of hope and reconciliation. One, a big year of change in World War II. For Germany, it started with a false sense of power, but problems were showing. Things were changing. In 1944, Germany was deep in war. The country was running out of resources. Bombs had damaged the cities, once full of culture and business. But even with all the chaos and destruction, life, in some way, went on. By 1944, Hitler's dream of a thousand-year Reich was failing. The Allies landed in Normandy, opening a second front. The German army, once very strong, was now fighting in many places, spread too thin and getting desperate. The German Air Force was struggling to control the skies. Inside Germany, things weren't going well. People were starting to disagree with Hitler. The attempt to kill Hitler on July 20th, 1944, showed that some people opposed his rule. The government responded with harsh punishments. The Eastern Front was a terrible place. Operation Bagration, which started in June 1944, destroyed the German Army Group Center. The idea that Germany couldn't be beaten was gone. The world was horrified by the Nazi crimes. The fate of Hitler's fortress Europe depended on the beaches of Normandy. On June 6, 1944 D-Day, the Allied forces attacked. Many soldiers died, but the Allies got a foothold. The fighting in Normandy was fierce and constant. While the Allies held on in Normandy, things got much worse in the east. Operation Bagration had wrecked the German Army Group Center. The Soviet army moved forward, freeing Belarus and moving into Poland. The German retreat from the east was chaotic and made soldiers lose hope. As 1944 ended, Germany was close to losing. The Allied armies, coming from the west and east, were crushing the Third Reich. Constant bombing had destroyed many German cities. Even though things looked bad, the Nazis refused to give up. In 1944, normal life in Germany fell apart. Bombing turned proud cities into piles of rubble. But the destruction of buildings was only part of the problem. The constant air raids were very stressful for the German people. As 1944 went on, the war affected every part of life in Germany. Food was strictly rationed, and families had very little to eat. Factories were changed to make tanks, planes, and other weapons. The rich intellectual life of pre-war Germany disappeared. The war was very hard on German women. They faced immense challenges and had to adapt to a new way of life almost overnight. With the men away fighting on the front lines, the responsibility of maintaining the home front fell squarely on their shoulders. This was a time of great uncertainty and fear, and the women had to muster all their strength and resilience to keep going. With the men fighting, women had to do new jobs that men usually did. They stepped into roles that were previously considered unsuitable for them, such as working in factories, driving trucks, and even handling heavy machinery. This shift was not just a change in occupation, but a significant societal transformation. Women proved that they were capable of performing these tasks with great efficiency and dedication. They took care of families, children, and the elderly, and kept the factories running. Balancing work and family life was incredibly challenging. Many women had to work long hours in demanding jobs and then come home to take care of their children and elderly relatives. The emotional and physical toll was immense, but they persevered out of a sense of duty and love for their families. Women worked long hours in factories, often in dangerous conditions, making weapons for very little pay. The factories were not always safe, and accidents were common. Despite the risks, these women continued to work tirelessly, knowing that their efforts were crucial for the war effort. Their contributions were invaluable, yet they were often underappreciated and underpaid. They did this out of duty, and to support their loved ones at war. Writing letters to soldiers was one way they stayed connected with their husbands, brothers, and sons. These letters were a lifeline, providing emotional support and a sense of normalcy amidst the chaos. Children also suffered greatly during this time. They missed their fathers and had to grow up quickly, taking on responsibilities that were far beyond their years. Schools were used by the military or destroyed by bombs. Education was disrupted, and many children had to continue their studies in makeshift classrooms, or not at all. The constant threat of air raids meant that children lived in a state of perpetual fear. Their daily lives were marked by uncertainty and danger, and the impact on their education and mental well-being was profound. Many children lost their fathers, leaving them with emotional scars. The absence of a parent during such a formative time in their lives had long-lasting effects. These children had to cope with grief and loss while also trying to support their mothers and siblings. The emotional burden was heavy, and many carried these scars into adulthood. As the war went on, children saw terrible things: destroyed homes, deaths, and the constant threat of air raids. The destruction of their neighborhoods and the loss of friends and family members were traumatic experiences. These children were forced to confront the harsh realities of war at a very young age, and the psychological impact was significant. Many children were sent away from cities for safety, separated from their families. Evacuation was a common practice to protect children from the bombings, but it came at a great emotional cost. Being separated from their parents and familiar surroundings was a traumatic experience. These children had to adapt to new environments and often faced feelings of loneliness and abandonment. The war took away their childhoods and left them with lasting emotional and physical wounds. The experiences of these women and children during the war were marked by hardship, resilience, and sacrifice. Their stories are a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. The impact of the war on their lives was profound and long-lasting, shaping the course of their futures in ways that are still felt today. By 1944, the German economy was about to collapse. The war had used up almost all of Germany's resources. Allied bombing destroyed factories, transportation, and important infrastructure, making it harder for Germany to fight. German factories struggled to make enough tanks, planes, and weapons. It became hard to find raw materials. There were almost no consumer goods left and people didn't have basic things. The war had become too expensive. The Nazis printed a lot of money, which caused huge inflation. German money became almost worthless. Many German workers were fighting or had died in the bombing, so there weren't enough skilled workers. Factories had to use unskilled workers, old people, and even children. As Germany struggled, the Nazis used forced labor. Millions of people from conquered countries were brought to Germany and treated like slaves. They worked in terrible conditions in factories, mines, and fields. These forced laborers, including prisoners of war, were treated very badly. They lived in crowded, dirty camps and didn't have enough food, clothing, or medical care. Their German overseers treated them cruelly. Forced labor was also used on farms to replace German workers. People worked long hours for no pay, and were often threatened with violence. This use of forced labor showed how little the Nazis cared about human life. It created fear and anger among Germans who saw this cruelty. 1944 was when German society started to lose its moral compass. The war had dragged on far longer than anyone had anticipated, and the initial fervor and nationalistic pride that had driven the early years of the conflict were now replaced by a deep sense of disillusionment and despair. The once vibrant cities were now reduced to rubble, and the people who had once celebrated victories were now struggling to survive amidst the ruins. The excitement of early victories was gone. The parades and celebrations that had once filled the streets were now distant memories. The reality of war had set in, and with it came the realization that the promised glory was nothing more than a facade. The soldiers who had once marched with pride were now weary and broken, their spirits crushed by the relentless brutality of the conflict. People saw the terrible truth about the Nazis. The propaganda that had once painted a picture of invincibility and righteousness was now being questioned. The newspapers, once filled with tales of triumph, were now reporting the harsh realities of the front lines. The citizens, who had once been eager to believe in the cause, were now beginning to see through the lies and deceit. The bombing, the deaths in war, and the forced labor showed how cruel the Nazis were. The relentless air raids had turned cities into war zones, and the loss of life was staggering. The forced labor camps, where countless individuals were subjected to inhumane conditions, further highlighted the regime's brutality. The facade of a noble cause was crumbling, revealing the true nature of the Nazi regime. Germans had been told lies about the war, but now they saw the truth. The radio broadcasts, once a source of inspiration and hope, were now met with skepticism. The public news boards, which had once displayed messages of victory, were now filled with reports of defeat and loss. The people were beginning to understand the extent of the deception they had been subjected to. Their cities were destroyed, families were torn apart, and innocent people were treated terribly. The destruction was not just physical but also emotional. Families were separated, homes were lost, and the sense of community that had once been a source of strength was now shattered. The war had taken a toll on every aspect of life, leaving behind a trail of devastation and despair. People started to question the Nazis more openly. The fear that had once silenced dissent was now giving way to a growing sense of resistance. Public discussions and protests became more common as people began to voice their discontent. The once unchallenged authority of the Nazi regime was now being questioned by those who had once supported it. The failed attempt to kill Hitler in July 1944 showed that even important people disagreed with him. The July 20th plot, led by Klaus von Stauffenberg and other high-ranking officials, was a clear indication that dissent was not limited to the general populace. Even those within the inner circles of power were willing to risk everything to bring an end to the tyranny. The failure of the plot, however, only served to intensify the regime's grip on power. The government reacted with violence. The response to any form of dissent was swift and brutal. The SS and other enforcement agencies were given free rein to crush any opposition. Arrests were made indiscriminately, and the atmosphere of fear and repression grew even more suffocating. The secret police arrested anyone who opposed them. The Gestapo, with its network of informants and spies, ensured that no act of defiance went unnoticed. Civilians lived in constant fear of being reported and detained. The regime's paranoia led to a climate where trust was eroded, and everyone was a potential suspect. Fear and paranoia spread everywhere. The pervasive sense of dread affected every aspect of daily life. People were afraid to speak their minds, to associate with others, or even to express their true feelings. The oppressive atmosphere stifled any sense of normalcy, and the psychological toll was immense. German society, already hurt by the war, began to fall apart. The social fabric was unraveling as people fled their homes in search of safety. The streets, once bustling with life, were now scenes of chaos and confusion. The war had not only destroyed buildings but also the very essence of community and solidarity. Basic values like compassion and respect were destroyed by the Nazis. The regime's propaganda had dehumanized entire groups of people, leading to acts of cruelty and indifference. The moral decay was evident in the way people treated each other, and the once-held values of compassion and respect were eroded by the relentless tide of hatred and violence. As winter came in 1944, Germany was in big trouble. The idea of a powerful Third Reich was gone. The Allies were closing in from both sides. People were afraid and worried about the future. The sound of bombing was constant. The war was getting closer and closer. Some Germans still hoped to get rid of Hitler and the Nazis. The failed July plot showed that some people were willing to fight back. But for most Germans, 1944 was a time of fear, sadness, and hardship. The Eastern Front had killed so many soldiers that Germany was running out of men. The once proud German army was now made up of old men and young boys. 1944 left a deep wound on Germany. The relentless bombings by the Allied forces turned once thriving cities into landscapes of desolation and despair. The air raids, which aimed to cripple the Nazi war machine, also shattered the lives of countless civilians. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble in mere moments. The destroyed cities were not as bad as the damage to people's minds and spirits. Families were torn apart, and the psychological scars ran deep. The trauma of losing loved ones and homes left an indelible mark on the German psyche. People wandered through the ruins, searching for remnants of their past lives, clinging to memories of a time before the devastation. 1944 changed German society and how it interacted with the world. The war had isolated Germany, but now in the aftermath there was a forced interaction with the Allied forces. These interactions were often tense and filled with mistrust. The German people had to navigate a new reality, one where their former enemies were now occupiers and, paradoxically, their protectors. After the war, Germans had to face the terrible things they had done, like the Holocaust. The revelation of the concentration camps and the atrocities committed within them was a shock to many. The scale of the horror was almost incomprehensible. War crime posters and trials brought these dark truths to the forefront, forcing the nation to confront its past. This guilt and shame would last for generations. The collective memory of the Holocaust and the war crimes became a heavy burden. Many Germans struggled with feelings of complicity and remorse. This period of reflection and reckoning was crucial for the nation's healing process, but it was also a time of profound sorrow and regret. Germans had to rethink their history and who they were as a nation. Education reforms were implemented to ensure that future generations would learn about the past, not to repeat it, but to understand and prevent such atrocities. War memorials became places of reflection and education, serving as stark reminders of the consequences of hatred and intolerance. People no longer trusted authority. The war had shown the dangers of unchecked power and blind obedience. Post-war Germany saw a rise in political activism and a demand for transparency and accountability from its leaders. Protests and rallies became common as citizens sought to rebuild their nation on principles of democracy and human rights. The Nazi era showed the dangers of blindly following orders and hating others. The dismantling of Nazi propaganda and the trials of officials were steps towards justice and reconciliation. These actions were necessary to rebuild trust and to ensure that such a regime could never rise again. The world watched as Germany took these difficult but essential steps, but a new Germany started to grow from the ruins. The reconstruction efforts were monumental, symbolizing hope and resilience. Citizens came together working tirelessly to rebuild their homes, their cities, and their lives. This period of rebuilding was not just physical but also emotional and psychological, as the nation sought to heal and move forward. Rebuilding would be hard, but it would show the strength of the human spirit and the hope for a better future. The sight of children playing in newly rebuilt areas was a testament to the resilience and determination of the German people. These moments of joy and victory were beacons of light in a time of darkness, signaling the dawn of a new era for Germany. Even in the dark days of 1944, there was hope for a better future. The suffering of the war created a new sense of unity based on democracy, tolerance, and respect. The Allies helped Germany change. They brought democracy, removed the Nazi government, and helped people understand each other. After the war, Germany's economy grew quickly, showing that the country could recover. The scars of war would remain, but they would remind people of the importance of peace and working together. What happened in 1944 taught the world important lessons. Germany's recovery shows how people can overcome terrible challenges. It's a story of hope and a belief in a better tomorrow. The year 1945 dawned bleakly over a Germany teetering on the brink of collapse. 5 years of relentless warfare had ravaged the nation, leaving its cities in ruins and its people grappling with unimaginable loss. The once proud Nazi regime was now a specter of its former self, with armies retreating on all fronts. The writing was on the wall. The Third Reich was living out its final days. The once formidable Wehrmacht was a shadow of its former self, depleted by years of constant fighting. Hitler, holed up in his underground bunker, refused to surrender, clinging to delusional beliefs of victory. He ordered suicidal counteroffensives, squandering precious resources. As Allied and Soviet armies closed in on Berlin, the Nazi regime's grip on power crumbled. Desertions increased, and acts of defiance became more commonplace. The year 1945 marked a pivotal juncture in world history as the Second World War raged across multiple continents. The dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 would finally bring the war to an end. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two superpowers, sowing the seeds of the Cold War. By January 1945, the Red Army stood poised on the banks of the Vistula River, a mere 40 miles from Berlin. The Soviet forces, fueled by a desire for revenge, advanced relentlessly, pushing back the remnants of the Wehrmacht. The German defenses crumbled under the sheer weight of the Soviet onslaught. For the Red Army, Berlin was the lair of the Nazi beast, the heart of the regime that had unleashed horrors upon their homeland. As the Red Army drew closer to Berlin, the city's inhabitants braced for the inevitable onslaught. The German capital, once a symbol of Nazi power, was now a city under siege, its streets patrolled by weary soldiers and terrified civilians. Amidst the chaos, pockets of resistance emerged, with groups of German soldiers and civilians preparing to fight to the death. Armed with a motley assortment of weapons, these units fought with desperate courage. By late April, the Red Army had encircled Berlin, tightening its grip on the city. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet troops just a few blocks from his bunker, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. On May 2, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling surrendered Berlin to the Soviets, marking the end of the Battle of Berlin. The news of Germany's unconditional surrender sparked celebrations across the Allied world. The instruments of surrender, signed in Reims and Berlin on May 7 and 8, marked the absolute defeat of Nazi Germany. This surrender signified the collapse of the Third Reich and the end of its reign of terror. The term Stunde Null, 0 hour, encapsulated the sentiment of this period, a complete obliteration of the past. The collapse of the Nazi regime brought a chilling realization the atrocities committed in its name were now impossible to ignore. The liberation of concentration camps revealed the true horrors of the Holocaust. Even as the echoes of gunfire faded, a new reality began to take shape: occupation. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, administered by the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. Berlin, though located within the Soviet zone, was itself divided, mirroring the 4-way division of the country. The division of Germany cut to the core of the nation's identity, sowing the seeds of mistrust that would characterize the Cold War era. The immediate aftermath of the war presented a scene of unimaginable devastation. German cities lay in ruins, and the transportation infrastructure was crippled. Amidst the ruins, the indomitable spirit of survival flickered as Germans began the arduous task of rebuilding. Women played a pivotal role in the reconstruction effort, their determination a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The winter of 1945–46 descended upon a defeated Germany with a brutality that mirrored the war just ended. The collapse of the Nazi regime had brought the disintegration of the centralized food distribution system, leaving millions on the brink of starvation. The agricultural heartland lay in ruins, and the transportation network was crippled. The streets became haunted by skeletal figures, their bodies slowly shutting down from lack of sustenance. Beyond the immediate threat of starvation, German society grappled with the profound social and psychological dislocations wrought by war and defeat. The physical landscape, scarred by bombing and littered with rubble, mirrored the fractured state of the nation's psyche. Millions were homeless, their homes reduced to piles of bricks and twisted metal. Families, torn apart by conflict and displacement, struggled to reunite amidst the chaos. The social fabric, already frayed by years of Nazi rule, threatened to unravel completely. The influx of millions of refugees and expellees from Germany's former eastern territories added another layer of complexity to the already daunting challenges of post-war recovery. Driven from their homes by advancing Soviet forces and facing often brutal reprisals, these displaced individuals arrived in the remnants of what was once the Third Reich, carrying with them little but the trauma of their experiences and the meager possessions they could salvage. Their arrival placed an immense strain on the already scarce resources and fueled social tensions in a society grappling with its own losses and uncertainties. The psychological scars of war ran deep. Years of Nazi propaganda, with its messages of hate and division, had poisoned the well of human interaction. The horrors of the war, the constant fear of bombing raids, the loss of loved ones, and the exposure to unimaginable atrocities left an indelible mark on the collective psyche. The task of rebuilding, not just homes and infrastructure, but also trust and a sense of shared purpose, seemed insurmountable. As the dust settled on the ruins of the Third Reich, the Allied powers faced the daunting task of rebuilding Germany, both physically and morally. Central to this endeavor was the process of denazification, a complex undertaking to purge Nazi ideology and bring war criminals to justice. The Nuremberg trials, held between 1945 and 1949, were the most visible effort to hold Nazi leaders accountable. These trials aimed to expose Nazi horrors and establish a legal framework for prosecuting crimes against humanity. The sight of high-ranking Nazis in the dock forced the world to confront Nazi barbarity. Denazification extended beyond the trials, scrutinizing teachers, doctors, lawyers, and civil servants. This process, while necessary, was often arbitrary and inconsistent, leading to resentment. Even as the Allied powers collaborated on the denazification of Germany and the prosecution of war criminals, the seeds of division were already being sown. The wartime alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, forged in the crucible of shared struggle against Nazi Germany, began to unravel as the ideological differences between the capitalist West and the communist East resurfaced with renewed vigor. Germany, once the heart of a united Reich, found itself increasingly caught in the middle of this emerging Cold War rivalry. The division of Germany into 4 occupation zones, initially intended as a temporary measure, solidified into a stark symbol of the growing East-West divide. The Soviet Union, determined to establish a buffer zone between itself and the West, tightened its grip on its zone of occupation, imposing communist political and economic structures. The Western Allies, wary of Soviet intentions, responded in kind, promoting democratic values and fostering economic recovery in their zones. The city of Berlin, physically located within the Soviet zone but itself divided into 4 sectors, became a microcosm of the larger Cold War confrontation. The stark contrast between the capitalist West Berlin, a beacon of freedom and opportunity, and the communist East Berlin, increasingly isolated and controlled, highlighted the growing ideological gulf between the two superpowers. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961, a physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain that had descended across Europe, served as a stark reminder of the human cost of this division. A nation reforged, the two Germanys emerge. The year 1945 marked the end of a catastrophic war and the beginning of a profound reshaping of Germany. From the ashes arose two distinct German states, each reflecting the ideology of its occupying power. The Federal Republic of Germany embraced democracy and a market economy, aligning with the Western Bloc. The German Democratic Republic followed the Soviet model, adopting socialism and becoming a Soviet satellite state. The emergence of two Germanys, separated by a fortified border, cemented Europe's division and the legacy of World War II. The Wirtschaftswunder, the miracle on the Rhine. In the western zones of occupied Germany, a remarkable transformation was taking place. From the ashes of war emerged a vibrant and dynamic economy, fueled by a potent mix of free market principles, American aid, and the sheer determination of the German people to rebuild their shattered lives. This period of rapid economic growth, known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, saw West Germany rise from the ruins of World War II to become one of the world's leading industrial powers. The foundations for this economic miracle were laid by a combination of factors. The Marshall Plan, a massive aid program funded by the United States, provided crucial financial assistance, helping to rebuild infrastructure and kickstart industrial production. The adoption of a social market economy, a model that combined free market principles with a strong social safety net, fostered both economic growth and social stability. The currency reform of 1948, which introduced the Deutsche Mark, curbed inflation and restored confidence in the German economy. The German people, known for their industriousness and discipline, embraced the challenge of rebuilding with characteristic vigor. They worked tirelessly, often in difficult conditions, to reconstruct their cities, factories, and lives. The Wirtschaftswunder was not merely an economic phenomenon, it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity for renewal and growth even in the face of unimaginable adversity. Scars of division, the Berlin Wall, and the Cold War. While West Germany experienced an economic resurgence, the division of Germany and the broader Cold War cast a long shadow over the nation's recovery. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, stood as a stark symbol of the ideological divide that separated East and West. This concrete barrier, heavily guarded and stretching for miles, effectively cut the city in two, severing families and communities and transforming Berlin into a front line in the Cold War. The construction of the Berlin Wall, while ostensibly aimed at stemming the flow of refugees from east to west, served as a powerful propaganda tool for both sides. For the West, it represented the brutality of the communist regime, its willingness to erect physical barriers to suppress the human desire for freedom. For the East, it was portrayed as a necessary measure to protect its citizens from the corrupting influences of capitalist ideology. The Berlin Wall became a focal point for Cold War tensions, with several high-profile incidents, such as the Checkpoint Charlie standoff in 1961, bringing the superpowers to the brink of confrontation. The wall also served as a constant reminder of the human cost of the Cold War, with countless families separated and individuals risking their lives to escape from east to west. Legacies of 1945, a year etched in history. The year 1945 stands as a pivotal moment in German history, a year that marked both the end of an era and the beginning of a new and uncertain future. The defeat of Nazi Germany, the unconditional surrender, and the subsequent occupation ushered in a period of profound transformation, reshaping the political, social, and economic landscape of the nation. The scars of war, both physical and psychological, ran deep, serving as a constant reminder of the horrors of the past and the challenges of rebuilding. The division of Germany, a consequence of the broader Cold War rivalry, cast a long shadow over the post-war decades. The emergence of two German states, each embodying a distinct ideological system, highlighted the enduring legacy of World War II. The Berlin Wall, a potent symbol of this division, stood as a stark reminder of the human cost of the Cold War. Despite the challenges and divisions, the spirit of renewal and the determination to learn from the mistakes of the past ultimately prevailed. The reunification of Germany in 1990, marked by the fall of the Berlin Wall, offered a powerful symbol of hope and reconciliation. The lessons learned from the tumultuous events of 1945 continue to shape German identity and foreign policy to this day, serving as a reminder of the importance of democracy, tolerance, and international cooperation.
Du meine Arbeit für richtig hältst, ob du glaubst, dass ich fleißig gewesen bin, dass ich gearbeitet habe, dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste